of the Matter podcast. I'm Robbie Santiago, joined by Ren Ferguson. And as we mentioned last week, we fired Ryan.
Yep.
But hopefully he'll be reinstated here in a couple weeks or so. But no, just joking. Since he doesn't live 5 or 10 minutes away anymore, it's harder for us to get together on a date because he's traveling from a pretty long distance, and so this time it just didn't happen to work out. But Lord willing, he'll be back with us shortly. Anyway, we are called the conclusion of the matter because Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So that's why we are called the conclusion of the matter and have been for close to how many years now? 4?
Yeah.
I think we started in 2021.
I
Does
think
that sound right? 21 or 22.
7 seasons. We do 2 a year usually.
So, yeah.
Probably about 3.5 to 4 years.
So we've had a pretty good run.
Yeah, we have.
We've enjoyed it, and we hope that you guys have as well.
Yes.
But anyway, we are going to have a new topic for today that we kind of seem to do every year, but I'm going to kick it over to Ren, and he's going to tell you about it.
Well, today we're going to be talking about gratitude or thankfulness. Since this is going to be releasing the week of Thanksgiving, we figured it'd be a good idea maybe to kind of touch on this again. It's always a good reminder, not just on the week of Thanksgiving, but it's something good for us to remember all of the time. And I'm sure we'll probably talk about that more as we go through. But just, we like to say the attitude of gratitude. And it's so important for us. I think especially in our culture, because I know you and I have both traveled outside of the U.S. and have been to some third world countries and things like that.
They're very
Gratitude
grateful.
does not seem to be an issue in those types of places. Not with at least the general populace. Obviously, there's still going to be some problems, but it definitely more so seems to be an issue in like first world
what we call
countries.
first world problems.
Yeah.
I'd agree. Even I don't remember if I've ever told this story before or not, but when we went on a mission trip, I was probably about maybe 15. We had gone 2 years previous, but I think this was the second time that I went. But there was this man that I gave a pair of shoes to at the very end of the trip, and it was just a pair of like Walmart flip-flops or something. And I mean, that man was so great. There was a language barrier, obviously.
Yeah.
But you could just tell that he was so like moved and grateful for that. And, if I gave that to any of my students in class, they would have like thrown it in the trash can on the way
what is
out,
this?
probably.
Yeah.
And so, and granted, of course, like there's differences between, the standard of living between us and Nicaragua in that case.
Yeah.
But I don't think that our mentality should change. And really, I think Americans and other people in the first worlds should be a lot more like those in the third world in terms of their mentalities. Even it drastically reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, because it's that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think too, when we talk about gratitude, I think there's a difference in mentality, like between those types of cultures and our culture, where that culture is focused on what it has, and our culture is focused on what we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates, well, in their case, it creates gratitude because they're focused primarily on what they have, and they're not concerned or obsessed with the things that they don't have. I mean, and look, pointing the finger at myself, you get on Amazon and you start scrolling, and I mean, you see all of this stuff. You got these, I don't know how many different lists we have to categorize the different stuff that we're wanting, especially this time of year with Christmas lists, people buying stuff. And it's just like you can get on there and you can just scroll and be like, oh, I want that. I want that. Or Facebook
literally like one
Marketplace or
click
anything.
too.
Yeah. Facebook Marketplace, you can do the same thing. And I mean, it's just we're constantly thinking about getting more. And so especially this time of year, but I think as Christians, the scriptures teach that this should be a part of who we are, It should be a part of Christian culture of not focusing so much on what we don't have and focusing more on what we do have. And so I'm sure we'll look at some scriptures. Do you have anything?
No, not before we kind of get into scriptures, I guess. I mean, other than kind of reiterating what you just said, really.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, I think there's a bunch of passages that we could go to. One of the first ones that always comes to my mind is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, because there in verse 17 is the well-known verse where he says, pray without ceasing. But then in verse 18, which we don't always quote verse 18 with verse 17, but he says, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. So we do see, again, that there is to be this attitude of thankfulness that is to permeate, as he says there, and I think the important phrase there, well, one of, is in all circumstances. If you go back to the beginning of this book in 1 Thessalonians, I'll try to find the verse, but it talks about how, verse 6, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all of the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia. And he even talks about within this context how those in Thessalonica had received the same type of persecution that the Jews who had converted to Christ had received from their own people. And so they're suffering. These people that he's writing to are suffering. And he ends this letter, in part at least, by telling them to be thankful in every circumstance that they may find themselves in. And I think that's something that, again, for us, a lot of times is very foreign. And I think, I don't know, maybe that's just a human thing, not necessarily pertaining to us in our culture specifically. But when you're suffering, it's hard to express thanks. It's hard to be thankful.
That was kind of the point that I was going to make, is it can be a little bit easier at times to be a little bit more grateful when things are going really well. But then sometimes when things aren't going so well, that's when we have a tendency to complain. And instead of, I think last time I brought in a lot of like just random verses and things, and we'll probably look at those too. I have a few like at the end, but I wanted to kind of bring in examples of both sides of that too. And I thought it was ironic that you brought up the analogy of like the first and, second and third world. And I don't know that that's always the case. I think it is an indication in our world. But I'm saying when the Bible was written, there's also a tendency in other countries, obviously America didn't exist yet, to be either grateful or ungrateful. And one of them that I had was the widow's two mites. And that story, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, you can see that, even though she's giving her all, the mindset there is that, she's grateful for the things and is giving back to the Lord because of that. But then on the other hand, you have somebody that's a little bit more wealthy than her that, might give more, but, wasn't quite the same mindset that she had. And I think we can see that in our culture today too. We have some people that in the third world that still worship God and, give all that they can give. And that's different than, somebody who is, let's say, like a CEO of a company that may give thousands of dollars, but may just be giving it just because they have the ability to do it. And it's not necessarily like hurting. So,
it's not that sacrifice. But
I just bring that up as an example, is, being grateful no matter what your economic status is, as we see, in Scripture. Even this is a kind of a different analogy, but that story always tends to remind me of the publican and the Pharisee when they're both praying. Not talking about gratefulness in terms of like financial things,
but spiritual.
Spiritual. Just the humility that, we're going to give thanks to God, even, no matter what kind of person we are, no matter what, our background may be, whether economically or spiritually or anything else. But anyway, what were you going to bring up?
Well, I was just going to, because as you were talking about the widow and her two mites, it made me think about the point that, she had this gratitude and this humility in contrast to the wealthy, because I think part of gratitude is learning to trust in God. So then you're not consumed by the things of this world and hyper focused on how you're going to get this or get that or pay this or pay for that, and trusting in Him that He is going to do what He tells us in Matthew 6, that He's going to provide for us. And it just reminded me of 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, where he says, "And as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." The wealthier we become, generally speaking, this is not always true, but generally speaking, the more trust we begin to put in the money rather than in God. And so I think a key aspect of gratitude and thankfulness is putting that dependence in God or on God, and putting that trust in Him that He's going to provide for us and take care of us, rather than trusting in ourselves or trusting in our wealth. As Paul calls it there, the uncertainty of riches. I mean, it could be here one day and gone the next. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, how many wealthy people have had some sort of financial disaster where they're then left with nothing? And they, I mean, I always think of like professional athletes who end up squandering all of their wealth, and they end up like homeless. Nothing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so what you were saying about the widow and the two mites just made me think about that point. And I think that's a key aspect of this is putting our trust in God. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we just sit around and do nothing all the time, because like Paul says in
Parable of the Talents.
Parable of the Talents, or as he says in 2 Thessalonians, if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. But still, as Jesus says in Matthew 6, don't be anxious about those things, which I think we covered that in our episode about is anxiety sinful? Mm-hmm. Where I don't think what he's saying there is being nervous or thinking about it is wrong, but to where it becomes, the priority for us, because we need to trust in God for that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great point when you were talking about the trust in God for all of those things too, because I think in American society, there's a lot of emphasis on accumulating wealth. And I think part of that conversation can be that we make money just so that we can kind of like control what's going to happen next. So for example, like, let's say I'm just giving round numbers. I don't actually make, probably even close to this, but like, let's say I made like $100,000. Then if our air conditioner went out, then, that can be covered. If we need to get a new car, that can be covered. Even, a significant down payment on a house, X, Y, and Z. I think a lot of it, we like to be the ones that can kind of see what's going to happen next and how we're going to respond to it, rather than being in a position where we kind of have to rely on God because, we don't know how we're going to pay the bills. Yeah. And that's a big difference between like the third world that we were talking about, where they trust in God because that's, they don't make $100,000, most of them. Yeah. But all that to say is, I think that's an important reminder that when God does allow us those opportunities to accumulate wealth in that way, that we do it with the right mindset, but especially that, number one, we're thankful to Him for it. And then number two, that we're using it in a way that we can trust and rely on Him more, instead of trying to have more control or authority ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
But another example I was going to bring in was the story of the 10 lepers that's in Luke chapter 17. And I think this one's an obvious where Jesus, heals them. This one's not talking about economic at all either also, but Jesus heals the lepers, and lepers were complete outcasts. Like, they were seen, if you know what the untouchables were in ancient India, it's kind of like that, where they were, nobody would literally touch them.
They had their own cities, their own towns. They were, completely alienated.
Social outcasted, like, it was kind of like somebody that had COVID a few years ago. Like, they're like, don't touch me, and like, go to another city and don't come out of your room, and don't even call me. But or like somebody with the plague in the Middle Ages, they were seen as just, y'all stay over there and don't associate in any way whatsoever with the rest of society. And Jesus healed all 10 of them. Yeah. How many came back to thank Him, though?
One.
Just the one. And I wrote a note about this as well. It kind of mentions this in the first part in verse 11, but it also mentions this, I believe, in verse 18 or 19 as well, that when Jesus is asking him, like, where did everybody else go? He brings up that they were like foreigners, and most likely they would have been Samaritans. And we've kind of talked about this on other podcasts, but Samaritans were kind of seen as like these half-breeds, these lesser than type people. So not only was he a leper and seen lesser than, but also he was one that culturally would have been kind of a second-class citizen or even less than that. So, but anyway, Jesus heals all 10, but he's the only one, even though there's this cultural divide, to come back and have the humility to be thankful and to specifically come back and verbalize that to Jesus. Yeah. And I think that's an obvious example. I had Paul and Silas in prison, so this was what we were getting into a little while ago, that it can be easy when things are going well to be grateful and thankful. But when things are going poorly, I mean, being in prison is a pretty poor thing to happen. I've never been arrested before or been in prison. One of my students asked me that the other day, though.
Oh, I thought you were about to say one of your students has. And I was like, what?
Not that I know of. I mean, they're like 14 or 15 years old, most of them. Well, I do have some juniors and seniors, too. I mean, you never know. But not that I know of. But, you know, I teach at a Christian school. I'm not saying that it would happen or not, but it's a little different than, let's say, some of the other schools in our area. But all of that, I bring up the story of Paul and Silas while they're literally in prison. They're singing hymns and praising God and giving their trust in Him and their thankfulness and their gratitude to God. And I think, multiple authors, James, Peter, talk about going through trials and things. And I think that gratitude can be at the heart of all of this and how we respond. And what I mean by that is when bad things happen, like if I were to be arrested and go to prison, for example, like Paul and Silas, when I do that, am I just belly aching and grouchy and angry, which would be kind of a natural reaction, honestly. But the other side that I should respond, that if I was arrested for this reason, like Paul and Silas were, that their mindset was, this was an opportunity that God gave us, and we should use it to honor Him. And most of the times when we have bad things happen to us, that's usually not how most people, self-included, respond. And so I think we could do a better job of how we respond during adversity and talking about what James and Peter talk about specifically.
Right. Yeah. You bringing up the example of Paul made me think of 2 Corinthians 12, where he's talking about his thorn in the flesh and Christ, how he pleaded with Christ 3 times to take it away. And Christ says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, this is Paul speaking, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So that goes back to, again, kind of what we were talking about earlier. Paul and Silas and the others that you brought up were able to have that mindset and even that, I guess you could say, gratitude and in a sense, thankfulness and joy, as Paul describes here, in facing the hardships, because they realized, well, as Paul's talking about here, Christ is the one that's giving him the strength to continue. Or even like those passages you mentioned, James or Romans 5, knowing how God is able to use those things for our good, Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. And so we can, I think a lot of it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, our dependency on God, because I think that's what we're seeing displayed here in 2 Corinthians 12. And because of that dependency, then we can be thankful when we face those things, because we know that God is able to produce good from it. And also, Philippians 4 and verse 11, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content.
That's where I was about to go. Yeah,
contentment and gratitude are kind of, I don't know if you could say they're two sides of the same coin, but to me, they're pretty closely related.
Yeah, and I was going to say the exact same thing, because I'm not trying to, go off the wall here or anything, but if we were to change that word content at the end of verse 11 to grateful, now that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be grateful.
Yeah.
you really can't separate those
Yeah.
two. That was the point I was
Yeah.
going to make. So that was a good segue
Okay.
that you
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, that's good. Well, because I think they are very closely connected. Because what we talked about at the very beginning, gratitude is focusing on what you do have. And I think that's very true of contentment as well. It's
Mm-hmm.
focusing on what you have, not on what you don't have, and just being thankful and present for the things that God has already blessed you with, instead of getting sucked into that more and more and more type of mentality. And you talking about, we were talking about the third world countries and things like that. The trip that Chloe took with us to Fiji back in 2019, the man who was there, he and his wife were working with the church at the time, and he told us, and just talking about their thankfulness and their gratitude, there's this thing called taro in the islands, and it's a root, and it's kind of the same consistency as a potato almost. I'm not a huge fan of it because it's still different than a potato, but that's the closest thing that I could equate it to. And he said that was for 6 months. They ate that thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That was the only thing they ate for 6 months.
I would only do that for cheese dip and Bojangles.
I know, because you
That's it.
imagine eating potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 6 months.
Apparently, you
can't-
couldn't even do it for breakfast.
I know. I can't imagine that. But they were still, I mean, and even in relaying that, they were just talking about how challenging it had been. But to me, it didn't seem like they were complaining or that they were trying to be ungrateful. They were just saying, they were explaining their situation.
Yep.
And even in that, they were still content. And I'm just thinking, I don't know if I'm anywhere near that.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. And that's a big difference between, first world and third world, or even just economic status or whatever, just because most people may not even want to eat the same thing within like a week or 2 weeks,
Yeah.
depending on what it is, So I think that's a great point. Unless you had more, I did have an Old Testament example I wanted to bring in terms of being ungrateful.
Yeah.
You got to guess on who it is?
Old Testament?
Or it's not who is in one person, though.
Are you just talking about the nation of Israel?
Yeah, pretty much the Israelites. Well, and I specifically was going to bring in just how ungrateful they are throughout their history, but specifically in Numbers chapter 11. And just a little bit of context, they complain about so many different things, but they complain multiple times just in this chapter alone. And this is right after that they had been delivered from slavery. They had just witnessed multiple miracles about God, and the 10 plagues and all of that, and the reason that they were no longer in slavery. They had just received water from a rock, another miracle, and manna from heaven every day. So, all of their basic needs were met, but they still found something to complain about.
Yep.
And I think we tend to have that same mentality.
Yes, I think so.
And then I had a few other just random verses that I was going to throw in, not unless you had more on the Israelites you wanted to bring in.
Not specifically on them. I was just going to make another point in saying, which I feel like there's a verse, I can't think of where it is now. I believe it's somewhere in the New Testament where it talks about the wealthy, how they hoard wealth. I can't remember exactly where it is, but going back to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 18, where he's addressing the rich, he says they are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. I think another aspect in people who are truly grateful for what they have, a common thread that I think I've noticed in those people is they're willing to share. They're willing to give to others, even when they might not really have everything that they need. Going back to the example of that man and his wife, they were extremely poor, and their house, if you can call it that, was attached to the church building in Fiji, and it was just basically I mean, their rooms there was like a wall that kind of divided them, and then a curtain for a door was basically their room. And every day when we would get there, they would have some sort of fruit, or they would have tea or something for us every morning when we would get to the church building. And it's just like, you feel kind of weird. I mean, you don't want to be disrespectful and reject it, but it's also like, why don't we need to be bringing
doing
you
that
food?
for you?
Yeah. But I think it again goes back to that gratitude, that thankfulness. People who are truly grateful, usually in my experience, are willing to share with others.
And I think a lot of that goes back to that we kind of have a sense of ownership of the things that we own and that we have.
Yeah.
Whereas they, it is
Yeah.
theirs, but they're
Right.
like, this
Yeah.
isn't, mine or that valuable to me.
Yeah.
Like, here,
If you need it, take it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we could really learn a whole lot from some of these other countries.
Yeah.
We really could. And if you haven't been out of the country, whether it's on like a
And
mission
Canada
trip or not.
does not count.
Yeah, but a place like Nicaragua or Pacific Islands and places that you've been, or just other countries kind of like that, like it really will open your eyes. It
For
will.
real.
The other verses I have, we had already talked about, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 18. But I had a few Psalms and a few others in here. Psalm 100 verse 4, talking about being grateful and in the right set of mind when you come to worship. I think that's a thing that in our culture as well, sometimes feel like we have to go to worship instead of we get to go to worship. But it says in verse 4, enter his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise, and be thankful to him and bless his name, for the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endures to all generations. But particularly when we come to worship, we should be in a very humble and grateful attitude, instead of like, I had to get up early this morning and get here and get the kids ready and everything else. So,
well, and especially since we don't have to worry about, well, I guess it's getting worse, but we don't have to worry that much about being persecuted because we're coming together. We don't have to worry about being faith into our assembly.
right.
And I think we take that for granted. We're not as grateful for that as I think we should be.
Yeah, I'd agree. Even I broke down a few of those. That one was dealing with worship in Psalm 100, but I even put James 1:17 that says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or shadow of turning. So all the things that we have, it's not because of us. It's because God has allowed us to have those things or has given it. But even I had on here Psalm 107, just as like, and this principle is reiterated throughout the Bible, but I had this one specifically to bring up the point that it's not really an optional thing either. Like, we're commanded to be grateful and to have that mindset. Psalm 107, right? Just verse 1, I'll give thanks to the Lord. It doesn't like say like you can if you want to,
Right.
but it says for the reason, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. And then there's several other things that it brings up in that chapter later on as well. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 20 I had that says, I'm going to back up to verse 19 for context, though. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord in the worship service, giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And again, it's not really an optional thing, but especially when it pertains to worship, be grateful. And then the last one I had was Colossians 3:15 through 17, kind of a similar passage here to the one in Ephesians. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Not optional.
Yeah.
Be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to the God and Father through him. Or to God the Father through him. So it's not really an optional thing, even though sometimes these attitudes, we make it seem like it is optional, or like we just don't put in the energy that we really should or the focus that we should. So,
Well,
anyway.
you got anything else?
Not particular other than this principle. Usually we talk about it, every year about this time.
Yeah.
And you started with this, but I think it's important to not only do this the week of Thanksgiving or the month of November, but we need to really commit this to practice. And we talked about in our Bible class today, well, not today that you're listening to this, but today that we're recording this, that I think a lot of our actions and a lot of our words and other things are a reflection of the heart. And I think if we have at our core that humility and that gratitude and that really thankful heart, then it's going to make it a lot easier for that to show in our actions and in the way that we think as well. And so, like, for example, if I'm focused on the things that I have in my own personal life and kind of have like selfish attitude, then it's going to be hard for me to genuinely show gratitude.
Yeah.
But if that attitude of gratitude and submission and being thankful to God and humility and many other things, if those are my core values of my heart, then it's going to be a lot easier to look for those things and be grateful for all the things that God's done in my life and in my family's life and all the blessings and things. So
definitely.
I was just going to bring that up as well.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
that's all I got.
All right. Well, we thank you guys for coming back for another episode. We hope that it's been a good reminder. We hope that y'all have a good and happy and safe Thanksgiving. If you observe Thanksgiving, if you don't, well, then I hope you have a good week anyways. But we also hope that you will realize to always be grateful, not just on Thursday, but every day. And continue to express, as Robbie just brought up in those passages, continue to express that thankfulness to God, because it is He that has provided all of these things for us. And so I guess that for now, as far as this episode on gratitude, we can consider this the
Conclusion of the matter.